Yesterday, CNN President Jeff Zucker issued this quote: "We are not investigators. We are journalists, and our role is to report the facts as we know them," which is exactly what we did. Yeah, okay, well, the facts as you knew them were wrong. Very wrong. I tweeted, "Wow, good on CNN for just coming right out and admitting it. They don't investigate." This is what I've been saying. They basically just read press releases and tweets. Well, Brian Stelter of CNN responded, "Tim, you're insulting hundreds of hardworking journalists. The meaning of the Zucker quote is obvious. He's contrasting federal investigators who are charged with investigating Russia's 2016 attack with journalists who are covering the federal investigation." Okay, first, journalists are investigators, period. If you don't understand that, we got a big problem. Now, this video is more specifically about, I'm going to come back to this idea, but Seth Weathers tweeted, "This is BS. You were not simply covering what federal investigators said about the case. You were seeking out like-minded individuals and sources on background to perpetuate the Russia hoax. Just admit you were incredibly wrong on this, and the way you covered it misled people." CNN drops contributor Mark Geragos after lawyer accused of co-conspirator ties to Michael Avenatti extortion scheme. So this is the big news. It turns out CNN puts Avenatti on the air all over and over again. Turns out he's accused of being a just straight up huckster, running his law office like a Ponzi scheme. It's being said now. I think someone said that. I can't remember who. Maybe Stormy Daniels. And now we're learning that one of CNN's contributors was implicated in this as well. So let's talk about what a journalist is supposed to do. Let's go back to this here tweet from Brian Stelter. Now, first, I want to say I have respect for Brian Stelter. I've known him for quite a while. Not like friends or anything, but I've met him at a few events, and he interviewed me following Occupy Wall Street. And I respect him for, pushing back. The most important thing we can have between anybody is the active conversation. And so tremendous respect for Brian for chiming in, and now I can respond to him. Here's the thing. Journalism is public intelligence. There's private intelligence and there's public intelligence. When you look at the role of a journalist in any capacity, it is the same as private intelligence investigators, private investigators, security firms. So there's been a lot of scandals and fiascos involving private intelligence and things like this. I'm not going to name any specific companies because I don't want to get into all that, but I want to make a point. There are people who do investigations. They do background checks. They supply that information to an individual in exchange for money or for some, medium of exchange. Journalists do literally the exact same thing, but supply it to the public in exchange for some kind of money or medium of exchange. My customers, I'm doing air quotes for those that are just listening, are the people who say, well, for this channel, it's the people who want to hear my opinion and my take on certain issues. My main channel is a mix, and Subverse is just straight news to the best of our ability. It's hard to always be right, admittedly. There's always going to be some margin of error. But the people who I'm servicing are the general public. As a journalist, I believe the public has a right to know almost everything. Almost everything. We have to recognize there's security issues and there's privacy issues. But I'm very, very much very, very heavily in favor of transparency to a rather extreme degree. I always have been. It's been one of my, core tenets. But I recognize the need for confidentiality, security, privacy. If you're a journalist, you have to. There's no absolute transparency. I have sources. If I reveal who they are, I could destroy their lives. So we don't do that. We maintain security and privacy. But ultimately, the quote from Jeff Zucker and the way Brian Stelter sees it, when he says he's contrasting what the federal investigators do with what the journalists do, yeah, journalists are supposed to do the same thing. Now, look, don't get me wrong. The federal investigators, I get what Brian is trying to say, but I think the way he's framing it is incorrect. I responded to him with a couple tweets. I said, "Didn't you guys axe your investigative unit years ago? After Covington, I would have to disagree. Random Twitter users had the story right before CNN did." Brian responded to this tweet with, "CNN has a big investigative unit." I heard that. I didn't know if it was true. I was told that, but I was wrong. Brian links correctly to the investigative unit. But the point I was trying to make was not necessarily that the investigative unit is supposed to do the same job, but that it was my understanding, which was incorrect. So CNN does have an investigative unit. So presumably Jeff Zucker's quote is wrong, I guess. CNN does investigate, just not on the big front and center stories. So I have to wonder then, if the argument is that journalists are covering a federal investigation, what does that mean? What does that mean to cover? What are you doing? Are you fact-checking? Fact checking is part of investigating. Okay. What does investigate mean? Now we're going to start playing semantics. A journalist sorts through information and tries to find the truth. Quite literally what an investigator is doing. Same thing. If you're a journalist, you are an investigator to a certain degree. I investigate various stories all day, just not to the extreme depth that someone like Robert Mueller would be doing. And to that, I can respect what Brian is trying to say when citing the Jeff Zucker quote. I am being a little bit facetious. I hope that was kind of obvious. The point I'm making is that CNN has just screwed up so many stories. And the issue is, as it was pointed out by Seth Weathers, it's going to be in the Brian Stelter response, that they were putting on like-minded individuals and sources on background to perpetuate the narrative. How many? So I will say this. I periodically watch CNN. I think Don Lemon is the worst, and CNN needs to get rid of him, absolutely, because he is an overt partisan, and he is just wrong way too often and says nonsensical things. The moment Don Lemon said could a black hole swallow an airplane, I'm like, come on, dude, what are we doing here? Anderson Cooper, I think, does a fine job. Okay, Anderson Cooper, after the announcement, said it's a big win for the president, and people should be happy. And I was like, oh, there you go. So I have respect for Anderson. And I know he's paid his dues on the ground. A lot of people don't like him. That's fine. You don't have to like him. But Don Lemon, I think, is just the worst. I think Brian Stelter does a fairly decent job too. But I think framing is really important. And so I would say not a big fan of CNN. If I had to choose my top CNN personality, it'd be Anderson Cooper. And Brian Stelter's a close second. Not that I think they're the best people in media, but I think they're all. I think actually I like Anderson Cooper. I think Brian does a pretty good job. Full respect. Let me put it this way. Clearly, they're going to want to defend themselves. They have no choice. For years, they pushed this narrative, and it's been wrong. Covington was wrong. And you look at all these stories, and the way I put it was, I responded with second response. I agree with you about Twitter and journalists, but the people at CNN have had a hard go at doing very little legwork on huge stories. Maybe it would be more apt to say they may be doing very hard work, but very much in the wrong direction. What I mean by this is, I think they're doing a bad job. I think they're doing a fairly bad job. There's a lot of things that CNN does in terms of just writing certain, more obvious stories, more simple stories, like a press release comes out and you can say, here's what we know, here's what we've seen. You can make some phone calls. I'm currently in the process of reaching out to some organizations for comment on certain stories. So that stuff is fine legwork. But it seems to me that whatever they were doing for the past several years chasing Russiagate, they were chasing the wrong direction. So sure, I'll look at it this way. If somebody carried a gigantic stone slab for 2 years, you wouldn't necessarily say they weren't doing work. But if they carried it 2 miles in the wrong direction, dragging it for 2 years, and you're like, dude, the pyramid is over there, where the hell did you go? Then you can't really say they did a good job, did you? So that's what I'm trying to say. I think people, he says I'm insulting hundreds of hardworking journalists. Hey, man, that's fine. There's a thing called working hard and working smart. And I think it'd be, sure, let's point out CNN journalists, you worked very hard, but really dumb. Wrong direction. And so I have to wonder, if Jeff Zucker is saying we're not investigators, we're journalists, and our role is to report the facts as we know them, which is what we did, and Brian Stelter is going to come to their defense saying we're not he's talking about the investigators, I have to wonder why so many conservative outlets got the story right. Now, I think there's one simple reason for it. When a story comes out alleging that the conservative president, Republican president, or a person you support, is a Russian asset or working with the Russians, then you're naturally going to be skeptical because you're like, there's no way. That's ridiculous. And if you're someone who opposes him, you're going to be more likely to believe it. It's confirmation bias. So here's what I think. What do we really get out of this? We can see CNN is biased. They are. When you go to, there's a website called All Sides, I think it's called. Google it. It's great. They do a breakdown of the political slant of outlets, and CNN leans left. They certainly do. And Fox News is on the right, and then you have like MSNBC on the left. So because of their predisposition, they look for things that fit their own pattern, and that's the problem. Journalists need to be independent, right? They need to not be partisan, but increasingly, as Matt Taibbi put it in this great article, journalists are now taking sides. There's no longer just I'm going to stand back and try and figure things out. Everyone's kind of just getting involved. And as much as, look, human beings are going to have opinions, right? A lot of people confuse objectivity with omniscience. You'll hear people say there's no such thing as objectivity. That's false. Journalists can be objective, and it's really simple. Look at this background picture, right? Let's use this as an example. If this dude right here threw a rock at this dude, I could objectively tell you this dude threw a rock at this dude. Why? I don't know either of them. But I'll tell you what, if this dude right here on the bike was my brother, and this dude threw a rock, I'd be like, that guy was attacking my brother. Well, that's biased, right? I'm clearly acting in the defense of my personal interests. Objectivity is a real thing. What we're seeing from this, in my opinion, is CNN is biased. And so MSNBC is actually a better example because, look, admittedly, I think CNN chased the Trump bump. I think they had on a bunch of these people parroting these opinions, saying like, Brennan and these people saying like, oh, it's going to happen. We got the evidence. MSNBC was worse. They actually ran a segment where Rachel Maddow was like, Trump held a rally in Concord, North Carolina. Who flew to that city on the same day? A Russian. Like apparently some Russian businessman flew in. And I'm like, yes, sometimes people fly to cities. That's ridiculous. Maybe there's people like the point is, did MSNBC cover the story about the New Zealand businessman flying to Concord or the Chinese businessman flying to New York? No, it's because they're looking for something and they see it. It's kind of like how when you first learn a word, you hear it all the time. Or when you buy a new car, you see them everywhere. Yes, it's because it's like they say, out of sight, out of mind. When you put something in your perspective, you start noticing it more. And because of that, you end up with CNN putting on people saying these things over and over again. Look at these montages of the walls are closing in, the walls are closing in, Russia, 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 Putin, Putin, Putin. Final question, just for Brian, for CNN, I get it. But why were the skeptics right on this one? Why was Michael Tracy right? Why was Kyle Kalinske right? Why was Glenn Greenwald right? These are progressives. Okay, these are people who don't like Donald Trump to a much further degree than I would. I'm rather tepid. Like, I don't like the guy, but I'm not like, I don't make constant videos about, I just rather indifferent on the presidency because to me it's always the same. But why then do you have progressives who just really don't like Trump? They hate him. Saying, yes, but come on, saying it's a Russian asset is insane. How were they able to see through this and break through that bias? More importantly, if CNN couldn't do this, how come so many outlets were able to dissect the information coming out and say it's just not true? Why is it that BuzzFeed claimed Cohen was instructed to lie, and then Cohen testified he wasn't? How many bombshells did we see from ABC, ABC, the New York Times, and then a day later gets corrected or retracted? Come on, man. So, yeah, maybe I'll end by saying this. Brian says I'm insulting hundreds of hardworking journalists. Okay, well, I certainly don't mean to be overly disrespectful, but I will say this. Perhaps sometimes a pie in the face is a good thing. I said that about me and Dave Rubin in a recent interview I did with him. To go without criticism would be a bad thing. You can't improve yourself. And perhaps CNN should reflect right now and get some criticism and be insulted a little bit. Okay, you chase this narrative that I avoided, for the most part, all of the Russia stuff because there's just no evidence. It was all speculation. And whenever a big story would come out, I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, right? If I got something wrong, by all means, like I don't think I'm always right. But a lot of the stories I did were about BuzzFeed backtracking, was about the New York Times backtracking. Why? Because when these stories would break, we had this trend of the story being retracted later. So I'm like, I'm going to have to wait on this one. Because it was just so many bombshells. And they would say, bombshell, bombshell. And then a day later, oops, made an oopsie. I'll leave it there. Look, I respect to Brian for responding and engaging. I think he's a fairly decent guy and he does a pretty good job. I know there's a lot of criticism of him, and that's fine. There's a lot of I get tons of flack from people. I know Brian does, and I respect anybody who's willing to engage in conversation and have that debate. And hopefully, the conversation helps us break through and do a better job all around. Ultimately, I have my criticisms, but I want to. As much as there's some negativity in the commentary and stuff, hopefully we can take this position and just have a productive conversation and come out with a handshake and a box of jelly donuts. I don't mean that disrespectful. I mean because if you don't know, Tucker Carlson sent him jelly donuts, which I think maybe was a dig. But if at the end of the day we can enjoy some jelly donuts and have a good time with a smile on our faces, let's keep it that way. I think we need to figure out how to do a better job of this. I think we need to do a better job in media. I'm not a big fan of media. These companies, for the most part, Not all of them. Media, I mean like the big players. It includes Fox News, okay? MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, they all have their shortcomings, and they should be called out for it. But I gotta say, man, whether it's tribal bias or whatever, Fox News didn't fall into the trap that CNN did, you know? So there you go. It's not like Fox News is perfect. No, by no means. I'll leave it there. Stick around. I got another video coming up at 1 p.m. I will see you then.